Hello. Thank you, CRS4 for inviting us. I was just thinking about the panel, and I saw that basically I'm the only non-clinician on the panel, which is kind of unique. And there are also, we were from 3 different continents, Europe, Australia, and the UK. And also I heard for the first time that Ian is not a programmer. This is, I can't use my joke then, so he admitted it. But my name is Tomaž Gornik, and I'm the co-chair of the openEHR Foundation. I'm also the founder of a company that builds software in this space. And I've been building software for, 28 years. So the idea for today is that I talk a little bit more from the software side, from the architecture side, and give you some use cases in the end, how this is actually used in real world examples. So I always start with this slide because I think we need to be very aware of how healthcare is changing. And this is clear to everybody in the room probably because you are involved in this, but people fail to realize that we have some fundamental shifts which are fueled by technology in how we provide care. And this is just one example, but it's quite clear that we are moving from the center of this graph to the different axes. And by doing this, we are disrupting healthcare. The reason I'm putting this up is because this also means we have to think about the software that is underlying the care processes that we support. So obviously any disruption brings new business models. And we see this today because we see many new companies with very different approaches coming into the healthcare space with different types of software. But this change is not unique to our industry. Many industries have gone through a big change, and one I particularly like because we're all familiar with is how the computing industry has changed. From 50 years ago, where we had a very personal computer, the slide rule in our pocket, to the big data centers which had the capacity and the capital to actually provide computing. But then as technology got cheaper and more performant, through mini computers, microcomputers, we got the computer back into our pocket as a personal computer through the phone. Now, healthcare is exactly the same. We had a very personal physician, I guess 60, 70 years ago. They came to our home. Then everything moved to the big hospitals, where in a lot of cases, a lot of care is still provided. But more and more through technology, we're bringing healthcare closer to the patient through community centers, retail clinics, and actually the phone as well as a device that can provide some type of care. So this is not unique. Every industry has gone through this, and maybe healthcare is actually one of the last. So there are many examples how this is already affecting care, about retail coming into healthcare, because every week people are already at this location, so why not provide healthcare where the people already are? Virtual, meaning that the ability to spread scarce resources and actually optimize the time of the patient and actually the clinician through virtual care. And the amazing thing here is that a large organization like Kaiser claims they do half of their healthcare or their visits virtually, which is really surprising. Then we also have to realize that healthcare systems are different. I took this slide in Orlando because I realized that in Europe you could never see a slide like that, of people actually competing for ER by publishing the wait time. But in the US, of course, this is the reality. The reason I'm putting this up is because we have to realize that competition of this type affects the systems as well. For instance, in the US, it's much more rarer for people to exchange data with other institutions because of fear of losing the patient, which is a high value service. So another thing which is quite clear is the merger and acquisition activity. And the reason I have this up here is because what happens to the data when something like this happens? When your hospital is forced to change applications because a vendor bought the vendor you were using. And if you think about Germany, which had a lot of Siemens, it was now bought by Cerner. So even if you have the biggest vendor, you have to be mindful that they could be acquired and you could be forced to change the application. So to summarize the introduction, we see a lot of new players from very different markets coming into healthcare because it's a growing business and obviously it's going to grow even more. We see that these players are from different industries using different technologies. And we believe that if we don't start modularizing the solutions, we're going to have huge issues of interoperability continue just as they have in the previous years. And we believe that there is no single silver bullet, that there are many companies that need to be involved in providing solutions, which means an ecosystem of applications and partners. So this brings us to the postmodern EHR, and the reason for that is we realize that in healthcare more than in other fields, there is no such thing as a big bang replacement of everything you have. It's really hard to replace existing systems. Sometimes it's lack of funding, sometimes it's people are used to using their solutions. A lot of times these solutions are very complex and took a long time to put in place. So how do you move forward without getting rid of the legacy? So the problems we're trying to solve have been well documented, and somebody mentioned articles that have come out in the last just few months. But two of the ones that are probably the most provocative are Why Doctors Hate Their Computers by Atul Gawande, and this one, which is maybe even worse, called Death by 1,000 Clicks by Fortune. And it talks about all these problems of how a lot of money was spent trying to put good IT systems into, in this case, the US market, but more or less the results were far below what was expected. And we're talking about $32 billion, so it's major investment. We have a situation where doctors are exiting healthcare because of burnout, and a lot of it is attributed to inadequate software support. So I really think this is something that has to be read. So the problems with current systems are well known. Like I said, those articles mention a lot of them, but usually we try to compare our industry to others, and we find that one thing which I was at a conference on Monday that struck me is that in other industries we have actually asked the citizen, the consumer, to do some of the work for the provider, like doing your own travel arrangements, not going to a travel agent, like using online banking instead of going to a physical bank. Many other examples. But in healthcare, we have not been able to have the patient take some of that work. And the funny thing is, even though they take work, they're happier with the experience. So patient engagement is obviously something that is lacking. And of course, it will be provided through IT systems. So to summarize, we need a lot of changes in this space. Now, looking at another industry which arguably has already disrupted, meaning that they have gone to new models of providing applications, we can take the example of the ERP industry, which we're all familiar with, the SAPs, the large mega suites, as we call them. Gartner, the consultancy, about in 2015, started saying that maybe the mega suite is not the right solution for the future. And they said this because the closed business architecture was built for the needs of the past. And what they're saying is that this cannot enable the agility and the digitalization that will take us into the future. So they came up with this term, the postmodern ERP. And we took this term because we think the same thing is happening in healthcare. It's just 5 to 7 years behind in the maturity of the market. Now, to go back a little bit from where we came, and some of us still are in this space, is we used to buy best of breed and connect them together. This hasn't worked too well because there's a high cost involved, and usually the integration is not very tight, meaning that we fail to send the right information across these integration engines in most cases. So based on the backlash of that, we got the Mega Suite, which is pre-integrated, It's a single vendor, but of course it also makes us locked into that vendor for a very long time. And the interesting thing started happening in the ERP space, where even if people had CRM in their SAP, they went out and bought Salesforce. Now, the same thing happened with human resources, with Workday. Now, the applications they bought were fundamentally different. They were cloud-based, they were upgraded overnight, they were easier to use, they were charged per use. Everything that the Mega Suite is not. An upgrade of an SAP could be a 2-year project. So what happened was we got what we call the postmodern ERP, which is a core that shrinks, and innovation and new applications, mostly cloud-based, happen around that core. Now, if you think about the companies using this, this is now a very common approach. It allows you to do innovation while at the same time keeping the systems running. Now, this is ERP, and there's a fundamental difference between ERP and EHR, and that is the data. The data in healthcare is much more complex, but it also needs to last a lot longer than in the ERP world. So we'll talk about how that affects the data. But another concept which is well accepted is something called the bimodal IT, which is that you actually need to have two teams. One team which is running the core, the core systems, and another team which does innovation. If you have this mixed, usually the innovation team will end up fixing stuff in the core, and you won't get very far ahead. But looking at the slide before, you actually see that the mode 1 is in the middle, and the mode 2 is around that core. So it fits very nicely with the modal IT strategy. The good thing is, through a survey, Gartner also found that companies are finally starting to invest, putting real money into innovation, which is that thing around the core, which certainly has been a problem in the last years, because as you're putting in the Mega Suite, usually you have no energy or money to deal with innovation, and it creates an issue of how to move forward. But coming to the EHR, what we find is that we don't have a single application in almost any instance. We already have a group of applications which are somehow connected together. What is worse, we have a lot of other systems. Now, I visit a lot of hospital systems, and some of the numbers are really staggering. The GDPR directive, one thing it did was that people started counting all the applications they have to figure out where they have patient data. And low hundreds would be an estimate for a medium-sized hospital, but I have seen thousands of applications in large systems. Now, sometimes they provide innovation. So they're not useless. Actually, they're very much fit for purpose. Unfortunately, they're usually not governed. Forget GDPR. They're rarely connected to the core systems. But the interesting thing is, once you put in the Mega Suite, a lot of those don't go away. They stay there. So the question is, how do we solve this problem? Because, as I've said before, it's really hard to replace the core. So the idea that the postmodern approach provides is, next time you're building one of those, we call them wild or feral systems, base it on an open platform. Because this way, as you are replacing the other applications, they can talk to the same data out of the box. So that integration or interoperability is not an afterthought, but it's built in to the software development process. So ideally, we get this bimodal approach, or postmodern as it's called by Gartner, where we have the core system, but we start building the other applications, the innovation on the other side. Now, you would think that those applications are relatively small, but I can give an example from the largest customer of a Mega Suite, which is Kaiser Permanente. They spent over $5 billion with Epic. They claim that 50% of their IT is not Epic. And it's not the legacy, it's the innovation. It's very hard for companies or hospitals in this case to wait for all the innovation to come from the same vendor. It takes years to build functionality that you might need. right? So you go out and you build something. So how do you do that? That's the question. And this is what Ian was alluding to before. Because it's really hard to replace, we need to find a way for the innovation to live next to the legacy for a considerable amount of time, until in the end we are able to either replace it or we're able to move most of the functionality to where it can function in a very new way, reusing information by default. And of course, openEHR fits in very nicely here because it's a persistence data model that enables these applications, as soon as you build them, to share data with the others that are built the same way. Now, they don't move over by themselves. A lot of times, most of the time, you have to rewrite them. But it's a continuous process where you can actually start small and take your time. So this is a way of bringing new technology in while not basically doing away with what you already have. Most customers really cannot do that. So this brings us to the health data. And what we realize is that in all industries, applications keep data in proprietary formats. Healthcare is specific because we want to keep this data for a very long time. Ideally for the lifetime of the patient. That's 100 years. Even if you have the best application in the world, it will not last 100 years. You will need to migrate to another application, another data model, every time you switch applications. So what is more interesting is that for imaging, healthcare has solved this problem 20 years ago with DICOM. Today, you won't find an image in a format, a medical image that is not DICOM. Okay? So the same thing with PDFs, or at some point it was CDA. Standardizing the format so that any application can read and write the same format makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, the structured data is usually still kept in the applications that produce this data. And this is what openEHR does. It's a vendor-neutral clinical data repository that takes data from the applications, enabling you to use different vendors and having choice at the application level, but governance at the data level. And I think this is the most important message, because you do not want to have one application for all use cases. Some countries try this. But you do want to have the same data because you're describing the same patient in many different healthcare scenarios. So the architecture that you get is something like this, where you have the three types of data: images, documents, and structured data in a vendor-neutral format, separated, of course, some common services, master patient index, and so on. Then you have a communication layer which takes care of access control and security and things like this. But at the top, you're able to offer APIs to companies that build solutions. And there's another aspect to this. Most of the time, small companies find it very hard to compete with the large vendors. Of course, if you're able to break the problem down, competition is definitely viable and possible. It's really hard for somebody to build a whole EHR for a large system. And of course, there's many vendors out there which work in the proprietary model. But solving a use case and sharing that data through an architecture like this is definitely possible. So by doing this, you can actually open up possibilities and opportunities for the local economies. So this is one aspect which governments should think about. So we've worked really hard with Gartner to actually validate this architecture, and about 2 years ago, we managed to get this statement from Gartner, which specifically says that to have an open architecture, it is not enough to exchange data in an open format through APIs. You actually need to persist it in an open format. Why? Because the exchange format changes every 5-6 years. We are now with FHIR on HL7 version 4, basically. And because the vendors are keeping the data in proprietary formats and exposing it through FHIR, there's no guarantee that there will not be the next one. We still have HL7 version 2 running in a lot of cases. So if you tie your persistence to the exchange format, you have a lot of issues when this changes. Think of CDA. a lot of people, whole countries have invested in version 3 RIM and CDA. What are they going to do with the data now? So this is a problem which is solved by storing the data in a vendor-neutral format. So if we look into applications, today these applications are built with a mix of code. What we actually want is to layer out this code so we can reuse certain parts of applications with different front ends and so on. So openEHR is a way to solve this bottom layer, the data layer we call it. Now we're working on the other two layers, but we don't have time to go into this, the process layer and the rule engine layer. This is the next step for openEHR, but this is maybe for the next meeting. So let me finish with some use cases. And we've talked about this, how openEHR has spread. We've seen modelers from around the world. There's many companies that have invested. DIPS is not on this slide. They're actually live in a lot of Norwegian hospitals. Tieto in the Nordics in Finland is launching their first openEHR EHR next week at HIMSS in Helsinki. A lot of marquee hospitals, some of them are here in the room. So we're seeing a lot of adoption at different levels. And the key is, of course, to get the vendors involved who are building the solutions for these customers. Now, I'll go through a few of them, but just an overview of the areas where we see adoption is the obvious one is the EHR itself. Now, it's a big effort to rewrite the EHR, but some vendors have actually done this already, and a lot more are in the process. Governments who already have data in different systems need to normalize this to a shared care record. Research obviously works off data that has been normalized from different sources. Registries is another area that in itself is a normalization effort. And then the last one, once you have collected all this data, opening up APIs and allowing different vendors, small companies, innovations, startups, to use this data to build better solutions. So I don't know how much time I have, but I won't go through all of them. I'll just give you a few examples of the bigger. This is probably the biggest one. It's a project that is running in Moscow City for 12 million patients, 1,000 institutions, and one single care record. They have built software on top of an openEHR platform and have normalized all the data in the last 3-4 years. And it's really big. It's 130,000 users. It's about 600 primary care centers and about 105 hospitals. So the issue they solved here is that they knew they had a big system to build. But had they gone to one vendor, they would have been locked into that vendor forever. Had they gone to 4 vendors who built the whole stack, they would have had a lot of integration to do. So they decided to provide the data platform and then invited the vendors to build on top. And this has worked amazingly well. They're doing some really interesting stuff with visualizing the healthcare system. Okay, that's not the Moscow case. Oops. Okay. But they have transformed the healthcare of the city because you are now able to get a first appointment in 48 hours. And you are guaranteed a wait time not more than 20 minutes from a system that 5 years ago was completely paper-based, and you basically had to take a day off to see the doctor. So, Children's Clinic, Philippines, I really like this one because it's a company that opened up 200 clinics in a year and a half. And I call this frugal innovation. They use Amazon. They sync between the sites because the internet goes down regularly. They use TVs with PC sticks to run this. 3 doctors' offices, a lab, and a radiology equipment in a $5 encounter. Pay out of pocket because the insurance is really, really not there. Pasientski in Norway. The second one is Backbones. Again, I don't have time to go into. Malta is the newest one, the national EHR record there. obviously Slovenia, where I come from. Finland was mentioned before. The Ostgotland region around Linköping in Sweden. Norway, we had a talk on that. Genomics England, we're listening to that this afternoon. HIMED as well. And some registries like Eurotransplant, National Breast Cancer Screening in Slovenia. And I'll just finish with the last one, which is, once you have collected the data, it really makes sense to open up, of course with patient consent, to apps and applications built by the community or small vendors. Medtronic is doing this in a use case. Inpeco is building this, the local company here. A number of trusts in the UK, Taunton and Somerset, Salford Royal, that's the digitally most mature trust in the UK. Plymouth Hospitals. Basically, Andy's, I will send a link to the video. Andy talks about the Postmodern story, how they did this at Plymouth. So to summarize, I try to show you a little bit how healthcare is changing and how another industry, the ERP industry, went from best of breed to mega suite to postmodern. We believe the same thing will happen with healthcare. And the reason is that the life cycle of applications is very different from the life cycle of data. So we need to separate these two. And once we do that, the future can be multi-vendor. And in this case, the data becomes more important than the application. And this is something people don't realize, but of course you guys here working with data will know. But in a lot of cases, people buy shiny applications without thinking about the data. And hopefully through the day today, you will see how openEHR provides a solution for this problem. So thank you.